This is a 2003 Aston Martin DB AR1, and it's a tremendously interesting and special and rare and quirky car. Only 99 of these were made for the entire planet. I've always wanted to review one, and today I'm going to do just that, and I'll show you all of the quirks and features of this special car. Before I get started, big news, this DB AR1 is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is a tremendously special car, only 99 for the entire world, and this one has a manual transmission and of course a V12 and a lot of other wonderful quirks I'll show you. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this DB AR1 where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Aston Martin DB AR1. I have always wanted to film a video with this car. So, a little overview. The DB7 was Aston Martin's popular model sold all throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s. Near the end of production, two special versions based on the DB7 were created, both of which were designed by the famous Italian design house Zagato, which had previously worked with Aston Martin on a number of different models spanning back decades in the past. One was called the DB7 Zagato, and it was a coupe model that looked like a DB7 with different, more elegant, more beautiful bodywork. Aston Martin made 99 of these and sold the DB7 Zagato globally. The other special car based on the DB7 was this, the DB AR1. That stood for American Roadster 1 because this car was only sold here in the United States. Once again, only 99 of these were made, but the difference compared to the DB7 Zagato, it wasn't sold around the world, just here in the US. And once again, it had totally different bodywork from a standard DB7. Frankly, I have always found this car absolutely gorgeous. I think the DB7 looked great, but this was a nice, special modernization of the car, and it just looked more exotic, more exciting, and kind of tied into some of the Astons that came later, like the Vanquish, with this beautiful hip line in back. This was a truly gorgeous and truly special car, and it didn't have a roof. That was one of the things about this car. You see, Aston Martin conceived the DB AR1 as a vehicle that you would drive down the California coast on a sunny day. You didn't need a roof for that activity, and so they didn't provide one. This car was an open-top roadster with no roof that could be stuck on while you were driving. And that's probably why it was limited to the United States. Aston really thought of this car as something you would use in a warm weather climate on sunny days, not necessarily the kind of thing you'd expect to find in England, and so the AR1 was limited to the American market. Now, in addition to this car's extreme rarity with only 99 units made and its unusual roofless situation, it was also pricey, around $250,000 back when it was new. And remember, that was 20 years ago. It's big money today, but it was especially big money back then. But you were buying a very special car. So let's talk through this car's interesting quirks and features, starting with the most glaringly obvious, the fact that it has no roof. Aha, but it does. But it's not a roof that you can actually use while the car is driving. Allow me to explain. To do that, I have to get into the trunk, and accessing the trunk in this car is tremendously cool. To get back here, you flip up the Aston Martin badge in back, as you can see, and then you insert the key into the keyhole behind the Aston Martin logo, and then you twist it and you can open up the trunk. And when you're done, you put the Aston badge back, and there's this perfect magnetic action that just keeps it in place. Of course, you can also just press the trunk button on the key fob or inside the car. But anyway, once you get the trunk open, you discover that this car has a few interesting treasures back here, and we'll start with the top situation. It's inside this bag, which has the Aston Martin logo and has the specific chassis number of this precise DB AR1. Each of these cars got a bag, but not just any bag, their own corresponding bag that matched the car's chassis number. And inside the bag is what Aston Martin called the parking top. And here's how it worked. You drove this car somewhere and maybe you were worried it might rain. You didn't want to damage your interior, and so this top could attach to the car using suction cups. And then when the car was parked, water wouldn't get inside. Now, obviously, with a suction cupped roof, you couldn't drive anywhere. It wasn't built to go at speed. But if you were displaying this car on the lawn at Pebble Beach and there was a nice mist in the air, you would put on your parking top so your interior didn't get wet. And Aston thought of more than just that. This car also comes with individual seat covers for the two seats, and they are labeled DB AR1. These aren't just generic regular plebeian seat covers. They are specific to this very special car. As you can imagine, this bag and these seat covers are really desirable items for a DB AR1 since they correspond to the car and they're not just regular Aston Martin items. The other interesting thing to note back here is this car comes with two umbrellas, as you can see. Most Aston Martins do come with an umbrella, but typically it's only one. It's kind of odd that the car with no roof that was made for sunny days comes with two umbrellas, but they must have thought that maybe people would want to put up the umbrellas while they drove along in case the rain started. No, I'm just kidding. No one would ever do that, but I suppose you could. The other thing worth noting back here, this trunk is actually surprisingly large for a bespoke Italian-designed exotic car. You get a decent amount of storage space where you can put stuff if you want to take your DB AR1 on a memorable road trip. Just don't go anywhere rainy. By the way, one other interesting item in the trunk, there's a little nook specifically carved out for the owner's manual. You can see it perfectly fits the size and shape of the owner's manual, and when you take the owner's manual out to look at it, you will notice that even that is individually numbered to correspond to the precise car that this one is. Not just a generic general owner's manual for the DB AR1, you get an owner's manual specifically for your DB AR1. And next up, since we're outside, let's talk about the bodywork of this car, which, like I said earlier, I truly believe is gorgeous. And it's tremendously special compared to the DB7. It didn't really look that much like a DB7. It was a totally distinct, special car. Every body panel was different and changed and really absolutely gorgeous, completely reworked by Zagato. Again, had a pretty strong relationship with Aston Martin going back years and continuing with this car. And in fact, continuing today, because fairly recent Aston Martin models have also offered Zagato-based special editions. This car was just one in the history. Now, as far as the body panels on this car, they're all custom for the AR1, but unquestionably the coolest piece is this one, around back behind the seats. It is one large panel that basically covers both rear fenders, goes the entire way across the rear of the car and down the center of the seats. It's one huge piece and very distinctive and unusual. You also have these two rear humps that come back from behind the seats and sort of taper off towards the rear of the car, which gives it a very distinctive and very exotic look compared to the standard DB7. Now, another major change compared to the DB7 came around back with the lighting. The DB7's rear lights were pretty inelegant, actually. They were basically just horizontal boxes. They weren't really all that special. But in the DB AR1, as you can see, they're totally different. You have circles back here for the taillights, brake lights, and turn signals, with some cool and distinctive rivets going around the circles and looking like they're keeping these lights in place. This also displaced the reverse lights from their typical spot, and so they're placed down here at the base of the bumper in the center, which is also a distinctive look for this car compared to the standard DB7. Now, around back, you did have one item that was shared with the DB7, and that was the big old dual exhaust with one pipe mounted on each side in the back of the car. There's a V12 under the hood here, which I'll get into more in a second, but it sounds pretty good. Take a listen to a startup and some revs. Now, as far as exterior quirks go, another interesting one was the fuel door. This is also similar to the DB7's, but you can see it's mounted right here, sort of placed horizontally on the bodywork, which is unusual for a lot of cars, although several British cars from this era had a similar placement. The funny thing is the little tiny cutout for your finger. In order to open it up, you'd stick your finger in the hole and then lift, and then you had access to your gas cap to fill it up with fuel. As far as other distinctive items on the outside of this car, beyond just its design, for one, you get the Z logo on the side. This, of course, stood for Zagato. They placed this logo on virtually every car they designed, and it was a distinctive element of Zagato designed cars. Worth pointing out, this car does not say DB AR1 on the outside, or American Roadster 1, or anything like that. It didn't tell you what it was, you just had to know. But the Zagato badge gave you a clue it was something special. The wheels are also distinctive to this car, different from what you got in the DB7, frankly more modernized and, in my opinion, more attractive. They perfectly fit with the body lines of this car. And then you have the front end design. The grille in the DB AR1 was quite large compared to the standard grille in the DB7, which you can see here. The DB AR1's grille is actually more similar to later Aston Martin models. The grilles grew over time, as they did with a lot of automakers, and the AR1 was sort of a link to the next generation of Aston Martin grille sizes, and it was definitely distinctive compared to the DB7. So next up, let's move under the hood in the DB AR1. First off, opening up the hood is kind of an interesting process. You got a latch in the driver's footwell, which is pretty standard like most cars, but you pull the latch, and the hood, as you can see, is front hinged, so it opens toward you in the front. Now, most cars with front hinged hoods, you just open them right up, but this one has a latch to keep it in place, which you wouldn't really expect since there's no danger it's going to fly up on the road with the wind coming at it. Since the wind doesn't come that direction, it's certainly odd, but then again, Aston Martin from this era certainly had its quirks. The engine itself, however, is a fantastic one. A 5.9-liter V12 borrowed from the late DB7 models. The original DB7 used a supercharged 6-cylinder. Eventually it switched into this V12, which made about 435 horsepower and about 410 pound-feet of torque. Naturally aspirated, big ol' V12, which adds to the coolness factor of this car. And you can of course see the plaque right at the top, center of the engine that says "hand built in England," reminding you how special this car is, and even the exact name of the person who did the final inspection. And the engine number is stamped right there on this plaque as well. Now, with the big V12 up front making pretty decent power, this car was relatively quick. 0 to 60 came in the high 4-second range, although all-out acceleration performance wasn't really its goal. This was intended to be a beautiful car for top-off cruising, but it had the power if you wanted it. And this particular DB AR1 and its V12 have just undergone some significant maintenance, including replacing the plugs and coils, which is an expensive job. It's powertrain, but it's just been done, freshly serviced, also with a new aluminum radiator, so it should be ready to sing as you're driving along in the sun. And next we move inside the DB AR1 to go over the interior quirks and features. Let's start with the key, which you can see here. Fairly standard for Aston models of this era, and Jaguar used a similar key, but it's kind of cool. The key shaft is like circular, like cylindrical, as opposed to flat like in basically every other car. It's kind of a neat little special quirk of Aston's from this time period. But you open up the door, and the first thing you see is a plaque on the driver's door sill that specifically announces exactly which car number this one is. Not just a generic plaque congratulating you on your DB AR1, but it specifically gives this car's chassis number out of the 99-unit production run. Now, aside from that plaque, the interior of this car shares a lot of similarities with the interior of the DB7 from this era, far, far more than the exterior, which is of course completely reworked and totally different. but similar to the DB7 just means very quirky, and so let's go through some of the interesting items now. We start with the glove box, and specifically the fact that there isn't one. This car came out before airbag regulations swept the globe, and Aston didn't design it to have an airbag over on the glove box side of the dashboard. So out went the glove box when the airbag regulations showed up, and in went an airbag. But they did give you a glove box. It was just the center console, which gained a lock that you could lock and unlock just like a glove box. Simply a different placement, but definitely quirky. Another interesting quirk of this car is that the warning lights are not actually integrated into the gauge cluster. You can see the gauge cluster here, very beautiful, very 90s, early 2000s Aston Martin, looks cool, but the warning lights are on this panel that's directly above the gauge cluster. They're kept separate, which is certainly odd to see, but that's how they did it. Next, we move on to the engine start button, which you can see here is bright red. This car came from an era in the late 90s and early 2000s when engine start buttons were all the rage. The Honda S2000, the Ford GT, this car, many other performance cars had a button you would push, but they didn't have proximity keys that knew when you were inside the car. So you first had to put the key in and twist it and then press engine start. It actually added a step, but it also added coolness, and that's what people wanted back in the day. And next up, here's another interesting quirk of this interior, the steering wheel. The steering column is tilting and telescoping, so you can move it up and down and backwards and forwards. Strangely enough, there were different levers for these operations. In every other car, one lever, you then can move it up, down, back, forward. Here, you had to choose which one you wanted to do and then select that lever accordingly. And another unusual component of the steering column is it is labeled with the sides that the turn signal stalk and the windshield wiper stalk are mounted on. Now, the stalks themselves are also labeled. So you had the turn signal icon on the signal stalk and on the steering column. Then you had the windshield wiper label on the steering column and on the wiper stalk. It was very odd to stick those labels there, but for some reason they decided to do that. And another interesting decision in this car, the climate vents on the sides of the interior are mounted on the doors themselves, not just on the side of the dashboard, but actually on the doors. And when you open up the doors, you can see the climate vent opens with them. Now, that's not all that unusual. A few cars have done that, but the weird thing here is there's a switch at the top of the climate vents that allows you to direct the airflow on the doors. You can choose if you wanted to come out the vent, or if you move the switch to this position, the airflow will change to come out of this vent and instead defog your interior windows, which is a pretty cool idea, except for the fact that this car didn't have a roof. So those windows would probably never get fogged up. Definitely that's a carryover from the DB7, but it's still an interesting piece of design that probably actually worked pretty well in a car with a roof. And here's another interesting quirk in this interior. You look at the dome light and reading light controls up here, and you have a few switches on and off, as you can see for the reading lights, and the dome light on and off. And then there's one control marked 12 seconds, which isn't a typical control that you would see in a dome light switch panel. It's usually on, off, maybe door, but this one says 12 seconds. And I guess the thinking is you would switch it to 12 seconds and it would stay on for about 12 seconds after you parked and turned off the car, just to give you some extra lighting while you were getting your things. But it's certainly an unusual light. Also unusual in this interior, although common on exotic cars from this era, is the parking brake, which is mounted between the door sill and the driver's seat. And the operation is unusual. To turn on the parking brake, you would pull it up just like in a normal car, but then it would block your pathway to get out of the car because it's right next to the seat. So you could push it down, but it's still on, but down. It's kind of odd to see the parking brake down, but it is working and on. Then when you wanted to turn it off, you would pick it up like a normal parking brake, push the button in, and then push it back down, and then it was off. So looking at it, you couldn't really identify whether it was on or off, but it did make it easier to get in and out of the car. And next up, another interesting quirk of the interior of this car is the stereo, or the head unit, as you can see. Not particularly interesting unless you know exotic cars from this era because you've seen this before. It was used in a lot of different exotic cars from this era. In fact, Ferrari used this very same stereo head unit and branded it as Ferrari, just like Aston Martin has branded it Aston Martin. Now, the funny thing is this stereo head unit has a navigation system in it. This tiny little screen actually will give you navigation directions. This was just at the time that touchscreens and navigation systems were coming online, and so they wanted to advertise that a car at this price point had that system, even though by modern standards, it's of course laughable. Nobody would use it, and probably nobody used it back then either, but it was there if you needed it. Now, one other interesting thing you'll see here in the center control stack, you have two blinking red lights. One is the alarm light for the car, that's blinking just below the clock. The other is the alarm light for the stereo, that's blinking on the stereo. They're right next to each other, blinking at different paces, both protecting different components of your Aston Martin. Now, speaking of this interior, it's worth pointing out, as has been discussed with the DB7 from this era, that this car has some Ford switchgear in the interior, owing to the fact that Ford owned Aston Martin at the time that this car was developed and came out. So the power mirror control and the driver door panel, that was in a lot of different Ford models, going all the way down to the Focus and the Taurus back then, although it's also the same one from my Ford GT. Same deal with the window switches. You can see here in the center, they also come from Ford, and that was also true of the signal stalk, the wiper stalk, and a few other controls here in the center control stack. Now, with that said, there are some very distinctive, very bespoke, and beautiful Aston Martin items in here as well. One good example is the carbon fiber trim all throughout this interior. It looks great, hasn't chipped or worn, and it was rare in the early 2000s. You didn't see a lot of cars with carbon fiber trim, but this one has it and it looks nice. And you got the manual transmission gear selector. The top of it is aluminum. It's beautiful, imprinted with the gear shift pattern. It looks absolutely fantastic, and it feels great too. Heavy, nice to the touch, and very different from anything you would have found in a Ford in this period. Now, worth pointing out, the DB AR1 was not only sold with a manual transmission. You could get an automatic as well, although this car is of course superior because it's got the manual and 3 pedals. In fact, of the 99 DB AR1s, 80 of them had the manual transmission and 19 had the automatic. That means the manual is more common, but still there are some automatic cars out there, so the manual wasn't the full production run. Now, one big interior difference compared to the standard car, the standard DB7 Volante from this era, the back seats. The AR1 was a true roadster, meaning that it had only 2 seats, front seats. The back seats are gone. The standard DB7 had back seats. They were tremendously tiny, and you could never get anybody in there under any circumstances, but they existed. In this car, you instead have this quilted leather storage area where you can stick stuff, and there's even some straps to keep your cargo in place while you drive around for an even larger storage compartment in case you've used all your trunk. You just better not put anything back there that you don't want to get wet in case it rains. And now it's time to get behind the wheel of the DB AR1 and see how it drives. But before we do, a quick thank you to Aston Martin Newport Beach for letting me come and check out and review this DB AR1 and for selling it on Cars and Bids. Aston Martin Newport Beach is the #1 Aston dealer in the world. They have all the coolest, newest stuff and also this very special car. And so let's see what it's like behind the wheel. All right, driving the DB AR1. This car is so cool. I have always loved it. I have always thought it was really cool, and it is really cool. And now I'm driving it. I was just thinking to myself that if I saw one of these just cruising along, I would absolutely lose it. The first time I ever saw one, I was a kid. I went to some guy's collection because I worked for the Ferrari dealer in Denver where I live, and he had one under a cover, and I was like, that DB AR1, I'd only ever seen it in magazines before, and probably I haven't seen one since then. It's probably been almost 20 years, but this car is just so cool. I just think it is so beautiful, and it's so much more exotic looking than a DB7, because at the end of the day, the DB7 kind of had a bit of a Jaguar vibe. I mean, that was the whole history of that car, if you know, there's a lot of Jaguar in it. This car didn't look anything like that. It looked so much more exotic, and the flat, wide lines, it was just cool. And it's so rare and so special. Oh, and it drives shockingly well. So I mentioned this car has been thoroughly serviced, which I'm sure helps, but this powertrain is smooth. Nice, smooth NA V12. For all the great turbocharged motors that are out there, there will be nothing that ever comes close to a true NA big displacement V8 or V12. Also, this car is like smooth. It feels great. I mean, this car was built for this exact purpose. We are driving along coastal roads in Newport Beach. Ironically, it rained today, which is why I had to film inside. They weren't thinking it ever rained in Newport Beach, but apparently it does. Man, oh, this car just feels so cool. I like the DB7. I think the DB7 is cool, but this car is so special. And to have a car designed by Zagato, that's always a really special thing. A limited run Zagato designed car, doesn't matter what it is, it's cool. Very free revving engine transmission. I'm actually surprised by just how good this clutch shifter transmission situation is. It feels like a really great sports car. It is a very smooth clutch. You don't have a weird kink to it. It's not too heavy. It's perfectly right sized and feels right. And then the shifter is great. Perfectly notches into gear. Isn't wobbly or weird. It's a lot better than a late 90s, early 2000s Aston has any right to be. It honestly feels Porsche-esque to it. One interesting drawback is that the pedals are unusually close together. If you have bigger feet, that's kind of difficult. It's the same story in my Countach, which I drive with no shoes on. I guess you could do that with this car as well. Man, this shifter is just, it's excellent. It just feels really great sliding it into gear, and the clutch is great, and it revs very quickly. It's surprising. There's very little rev hang. It comes right back down, and you can very easily rev it up for a downshift and put it where you want. And it sounds shockingly good too. These people around us have no idea they're in the presence of such an unusual and special car. I think this car is so neat. I always have. By the way, I also think this car is cooler than the regular DB7 Zagato for two reasons. Number one, that car was just more similar to a regular DB7. And number two, this is kind of like this very special America-only treat. How often do you hear of a European automaker that creates a car just for the American market? It's very unusual, particularly in modern times. I'm surprised how much I like this car. Now, I will say, it's an early 2000s car. Steering precision is not where it is in today's vehicles. There's a little bit more body roll and float you can feel in the suspension. It's not, I mean, you're not expecting you're gonna get into a 992 or a brand new Aston Martin or something like that. Overall, I gotta say, I've always liked the way these cars looked and felt and exist, and the concept of these cars. I love a low production Italian design house design car. I'm a big fan of one-offs and custom built stuff. That's like a big thing of mine. So I've always been into this car for that. And the fact that it also drives well is wonderful. What a cool treat to know that this car isn't just about styling, which frankly is what this car is about. But it also has a very neat driving experience to it with a great sound and good acceleration and a great manual transmission. What a neat car this is, and a special car. And honestly, for the money that it's worth, one of the cars that would most drop my jaw if it pulled up to my local Cars and Coffee. My Ford GT is cool, but there's a lot of them out there. This thing you never, ever, ever, ever see. And so that's the 2003 Aston Martin DB AR1. One of the most special, most unusual, rarest, and quirkiest modern Aston Martin models. I have always wanted to review one, and I'm thrilled that I now have. And now it's time to give this car a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 58 out of 100, which places the DB AR1 here against some similar cars. It actually does fabulously in the weekend categories, beating out heavy hitters like the Ferrari 612 and the Lotus Esprit V8. But in the daily categories, the DB AR1 suffers a bit as it's not especially practical or high-tech. This is still a tremendously cool car, and I was surprised how exciting and engaging it was, fun to drive and truly gorgeous to look at.